Hello and welcome to Pacific1's group presentation. We chose the article Using Goal Setting and Performance Feedback to Increase Weekly Running Distance to Replicate, and that is by Wack, Crossland, and Miltenberg. Why target increasing running distance? Running can be very beneficial to someone's health physically and mentally. According to the Center for Disease Control, running can help you in multiple ways. There is a list here of 8 things. Controlling your weight, reducing your risk of cardiovascular disease, reducing your risk of some types of cancer, reducing your risk of type 2 diabetes and metabolic syndrome, strengthening your bones and muscles, improving your mental health and mood, which helps with depression, improve your ability to do daily tasks and prevent falls, and increase your chances of living longer. So you can see that this is a significant behavior to target. Previous research studies has been done on both goal setting and performance feedback, and they've been shown to be effective. But more specifically, goal setting was effective when used to increase performance of individuals in previous studies, including rugby athletes, boxing athletes, and individuals in an exercise program. These studies demonstrate that goal setting was effective for increasing specific target skills, but also overall performance. Performance feedback was an effective behavioral strategy to increase athletic performance in previous studies, including swimming and gymnastics. And the use of performance feedback here increased the athlete's performance across multiple target skills. So let's take a look at the original study. The target behavior, as I mentioned before, was increasing running distance. The independent variable used the behavioral strategies of goal setting and feedback. Participants consisted of 5 healthy women, aged 18 to 28 years old. They were given a physical activity readiness questionnaire to determine that they were healthy enough before starting the intervention. Data collection, they utilized a Nike Sport Kit and Nike sensor pouch, and this enabled them to record the distance of every running session for every participant. Baseline, data was collected on participants for a range of 2 to 4 weeks. A multiple baseline design was used, so the exact time that baseline was implemented for each participant varied. Intervention 1 was daily goal setting and feedback. Participants would set a short-term goal each day and then a long-term goal to achieve upon completing the study. The participants were required to run at least 3 days per week. If the goal wasn't met 2 out of the 3 times per week, then the participant could lower or keep the goal the same for the upcoming week. But if it was met, then the goals were increased. Participants participated in weekly video feedback sessions done by the researchers, and this was just done to discuss the data and if the goals were being met. 3 of the 5 participants failed to meet their mastery criteria. They were given the option of staying at intervention 1 or moving to intervention 2. And they had all decided to move to intervention 2. Intervention 2 was a weekly goal setting and feedback. Weekly goals were set so that participants had to run a certain distance a week. No minimum number of days running were required. For example, if their goal was 3 miles that week, they could run 3 miles in 1 day now, or they could run 6 days at a half mile each. To increase weekly distance, participants just needed to meet their goals for 2 consecutive weeks, or their goals would remain the same. And then they still participated in the weekly feedback sessions by video with the researchers. And after the study was done, results did show an increase in running distance for all 5 participants. Purpose. The purpose of our study was to replicate Wack, Crossland, and Miltenberg's study, but also to see if the use of goal setting and performance feedback strategies would increase our own weekly running distance.
So in order to replicate the study, our group members participated in all meetings and protocols outlined. There were a total of 4 participants, 2 male and 2 female. It is important to note that all participants were graduate students enrolled in distance courses through Ball State University. We noted that one of the reasons we chose the study to replicate was the health benefits associated with running in increasing one's physical activity. However, engaging in any physical activity when one is not in good health can be very dangerous. In order to make sure that each participant was physically capable of engaging in the protocol procedures, we each took the Physical Activity Readiness Questionnaire, also known as the PARQ. This helped eliminate any health risk that would be associated with the study. After doing the questionnaire, we all agreed with the results that we were physically capable enough to do the study. The 4 participants' names were Stephen Hardy, Kelly Kaufman, Marissa Davila, and Joe Donahue. So, in order to measure our physical activity, it was very important to define our behavior prior to collecting baseline data. We chose to define physical activity as any instance of continuous movement, running or walking, at a speed ranging from 2 miles to 4 miles per hour for walking and 4 miles per hour or greater for running. This made sure that everybody could meet the definition. Each participant agreed to download the Strava mobile phone app in order to collect data. The app allowed participants to add and record physical activity as walking or running, as well as upload the data for other participants to see as well. This was very beneficial as it allowed each member to see the progress of the rest of the participants as well as themselves. After defining physical activity and downloading Strava, each participant of Pacific Group 1 collected baseline data. The design we used, considering that after baseline data, we moved to intervention 1 and never pursued intervention 2, we used a multiple baseline across participants design.
The next step is to review our treatment fidelity checklist. The first thing we had to do was complete a physical activity readiness questionnaire. This questionnaire consisted of general health questions that ensured that we were all healthy and able to participate in physical activity for this project. Once we completed the physical activity readiness questionnaire, the next step was to identify an application to monitor our results. For this study, we needed to identify an application that would not only give us our total distance, but also the pace at which we were engaged in the physical activity. For our study, we needed to be walking at a rate of at least 2 miles per hour, and we identified the application called Strava to help track this. It gave us our total distance, a visual display of the data, as well as the pace that we were walking. Once we identified an appropriate application that we could all use to track our data, we obtained 2 to 4 weeks of baseline data. For this study, we all used 2 weeks because we needed to have our baseline data and continue with intervention 1 and potentially intervention 2. So we identified the application, we obtained baseline data across 2 weeks with a criteria of walking 3 times per week to get our baseline and move on to intervention 1. Once we obtained our baseline, the next step was to meet and each identify a goal for how long we would walk in each session going forward. So once we collected our baseline data, we met via Google Hangouts, discussed our baseline, and set a goal for the upcoming week. After week 1, we reviewed to make sure that we were each meeting our daily goal. If we had met our daily goal, we continued in intervention 1. So you can see on step 6 where it says proceed to intervention 2, we did not proceed to intervention 2 because each one of us met our daily goal in intervention 1. We repeated this process after week 2, after week 3, after week 4, after week 5, and we continued on. One of our participants logged more weeks beyond that, but for the scope of this project, we went through at least week 5. So we had 2 weeks of baseline data, followed by 3 weeks of intervention data. I had referred to the physical activity readiness questionnaire, and these were the 7 questions that we had needed to answer to ensure that we were prepared and able to participate in this study. The questionnaire asked basic health questions such as, has a doctor ever said you had a heart condition? Do you feel pain in your chest at rest, during daily activities, or when you do physical activities? Do you lose balance because of dizziness, or have you lost consciousness in the last 12 months? Have you ever been diagnosed with another chronic medical condition? Are you currently taking prescribed medications for a chronic medical condition? Do you currently have bone, joint, or soft tissue problems that could become worse by becoming more physically active? And last, has your doctor ever said that you should only do medically supervised activity? We did modify our criteria from the original study. The original study referred to running as an occurrence of physical activity at a pace of more than 4 miles per hour. For this study, we did have a few slight limitations. Personally, I have a lingering knee issue that makes running on pavement difficult. So we set a criteria of 2 miles per hour, which is a mile every 30 minutes. Based on this criteria, we were all able to answer no to these questions. None of us were diagnosed with a chronic medical condition. Nobody was taking prescription medication to address a chronic medical condition. So we were all able to answer no. So as long as we all answered no, we're able to progress without completing the more extensive medical history that would be required if we had had to answer yes. The next step was to, like I said, select an application that allowed us to not only track our total distance, but also our pace. So we were able to use the Strava application to track our total distance of our physical activity as well as the pace at which we completed it. This allowed us to make sure that we were following our criteria, that if we were walking at a pace of less than a mile in 30 minutes, we knew that that data point would not count because it didn't meet our criteria. So this was a modification from the original study. However, based on our methods and our criteria for what counted as an active physical activity, this application allowed us to monitor those results and be consistent. And at our weekly meetings, we could all check in with each other, check the distance, check the goal, check the criteria. So the Strava app served the purpose of allowing us to accurately track all of the components necessary to ensure that we were meeting the criteria for our physical activity.
So now we will move on to the results section of our presentation. Here is the overall graph for everyone's results. It is a multiple baseline across participants graph. On the x-axis we have sessions, and then on each graph's y-axis is going to be the distance run in miles, and then the dog leg is denoting where we transitioned from baseline collection into intervention 1. There is only the one dog leg because everyone met their weekly goals and was able to stay within intervention 1. Marissa's data is on top, then my data, then Joe's data, and then Kelly's data is on the bottom. So if we look at this graph here, everyone did 6 baseline sessions with the exception of Marissa, who did 5, and then we moved on to our intervention 1 data. And if we're looking at that, we can see some pretty clear steps in most of our graphs here where we transitioned between weeks into new weekly goals. Moving on to table 1 here, which is the mean and range for baseline and intervention phases. We'll go over everyone's average for baseline, everyone's average for intervention 1, and then the ranges for baseline and intervention 1 as well. So for baseline, Kelly had an average distance run per session of 0.11 miles. Joe had an average of 0.58. I had an average of 0.65, and Marissa had an average of 0.11, just like Kelly. And then in intervention 1, we were able to increase those averages, those mean distances, up to, for Kelly, to 1.2 miles per session. For Joe, 1.59 miles per session. For myself, 1.47 miles per session. And then finally for Marissa, she was able to increase from 0.11 to 0.77 miles per session. So everyone experienced mean increases across the board. And then, like I said, we did all meet our weekly goals, so we didn't need to consider moving on to intervention 2. For the range, Kelly's baseline range was 0.8 to 0.99 miles. Joe's baseline range was 0.42 to 0.65 miles. My personal baseline range was 0.51 to 0.9 miles. And then Marissa's baseline range was 0.04 to 0.36 miles. In the intervention 1, we were able to increase those ranges across the board as well. Kelly increased her range to 1 mile to 1.4 miles. Joe's range was 1.02 to 2.22 miles. My range was 1 mile to 1.9 miles. And then finally, Marissa's range was 0.38 miles to 1.75 miles. So everyone was able to increase both their average as well as their range for each intervention there. This table here, table 2, shows the miles run per session, and it is broken down per session. So we had anywhere between 15 to 23 sessions, depending on how each participant broke up their weeks. On the far left-hand column, we have the session number, and then it goes by whose data it is. So Kelly, Joe, myself, and then Marissa is in the far right. And then if we look, like I was saying, the first 6 sessions for Kelly, Joe, and myself were all baseline. Marissa started her intervention on session number 6. So if we look at session 7 for Kelly, Joe, and myself, and then session 6 for Marissa, that's where we start seeing those little superscript A's. Those A's denote that the daily distance goal was met. We did not list our daily distance goals in here, but we did denote that they were met, and then we did discuss those with each other in our weekly feedback sessions. So that is table 2 with our miles run per session. Now each group member will present their own individual results and their own graph.
So these are my results. You can see in baseline, I started off a little low. I was about 0.8, 0.9 miles for my running distance. And I will be completely honest with you guys that I am not a runner. I actually find running to be slightly aversive, and I did not run at all before this intervention. My motivation was all in getting the data I needed and getting a good grade in this class. So maintenance-wise, after that last data point, I did not continue to run either. But during the intervention, I did increase my running distance. And you can see for when intervention phase started, week 1, my goal was 1 mile. So from baseline, it was just a small increment up. And once I hit that 3 times a week, I was able to increase my distance up to 1.2. So like I said, just small increments. I wanted to set myself up for success. And once I did that, I upped it to 1.4 miles, which coordinated well with my long-term goal because that was 4 miles for the week. So I was able to make my short-term goal and my long-term goal during the intervention.
When attempting to replicate this study, what we really wanted to look at is how setting a goal could affect the distance that we walked or ran during physical activity. Every time I do an introduction video for a class at Ball State, I joke about working full-time, being in school full-time, and being the full-time father of a 3-nager. So for me, finding time for physical activity is just as hard as the physical activity itself. During my baseline, I did a quick walk around the neighborhood in the morning before work. You can see my baseline data is right about half a mile per hour. However, once I started setting a goal where I truly set out to walk a specific distance, you could see that I found the time. And not only did I find the time, but I found myself checking the Strava app to see, am I there yet? And picking alternate courses. It made me think about, how can I extend this walk? How can I get to my goal? Can I turn left instead of turning right? And honestly, it's set a plan for me and my family for the summer when my wife is on summer break. Instead of doing iPad and bedtime, our plan is to start walking around the neighborhood. And as you can see, like I found the routes that lead me to longer walks. So truly, for me, setting a goal really did increase my walk because for me it was a box to check. It wasn't, hey, I'm done, I'm tired of walking. It was, okay, I need another quarter mile. Let's turn left instead of turning right. And that sometimes even led to a much, much longer walk than I had expected to do. My overall goal, so from my baseline, I started with half a mile, and my goal was to triple that. My goal was to get to 1.5 miles walked. And as you can see on my last 3 sessions, I was up in the twos. So setting a goal really did help me expand on my own physical activity, set up a plan for the summer with my family, and really truly led to a lot of positive results for me personally. Um, I know that we all increased our walking, but for me personally, again, just having a goal in place, an idea of this is what I want to do instead of this is what's convenient, truly did increase the distance that I was able to walk per session.
So these are my results from baseline and intervention one. As you can see, we have sessions on the x-axis and then the distance run in miles on the y-axis. I engaged in baseline for the first 6 sessions, and during those 6 sessions, my average distance run was 0.65 miles. After doing the 6 baseline sessions, I progressed on to intervention one. I did not go on to intervention two. I met all of my weekly goals under intervention one, so I did not need to consider going on to intervention two. For the first 4 sessions, my goal was 1 mile run per session. For the next 4 sessions after that, my goal was 1.6 miles per session, and then my final goal for the last week of intervention one was 1.8 miles per session. As you can see here, I did meet all of those, and then over the total of intervention one, my average was 1.47 miles per session. As you can see, it looks like the changing criterion design that is embedded within the study, and it does follow that pattern as expected. And then overall, I was increasing week over week. Every week I was meeting my goal and moving on to the new criterion there. One thing that did play into my decision making for my new goals, it's not really a limitation, but it did affect how far I was running. Most of the sessions that I ran, the temperature was below freezing. So when I was considering making a new goal, I didn't maybe make it as difficult as I could have just because it was so cold outside during the experiment time.
So before we started the group project, I had never really used any type of physical activity app. I had recommended them to clients of mine based on hearing about progress and reading about progress that people had seen in others and in themselves by using physical activity apps. But before we started the study, I was already very health oriented and tried to be physically active as much as I could. So I really didn't see the need to use a physical activity app. Everybody I talked to said the same thing, that they use the app mostly for motivation, and I really didn't think that I needed motivation. Recently, I had moved from New York to Missouri, so that was a really big change in itself, and one of the things I didn't anticipate was the struggle with physical activity. In New York, you can constantly walk around, and you're constantly moving, even if it's just to go downstairs to the convenience store. You still have to walk quite a bit just to get to the bottom of the building, or even in more rural areas, you still walk just around the block to the gas station. So moving to such a small town in Missouri, it was a really big change for me that half the town doesn't even have sidewalks. There's not a lot of different areas to walk, and most of the time if you're going to go somewhere, you're going to drive because it's quite a distance away. It just makes sense. It's time effective. So now, or I guess prior to the study, I was lacking a bit of motivation. Not really motivation, but I was lacking a setting that provided me an opportunity for physical activity. And I had thought about getting a gym membership and everything like that, but when walking is just added to your day naturally, it's a lot easier. So as you can see by my results, my baseline data was pretty low, and then I did increase continuously throughout the intervention. And you do see that I have quite a few little data plots. And that's because one of the things that I did not anticipate prior to the start of the study was how weather would play a role in this. And Missouri has some of the craziest weather that I've ever seen, but it has even a more unsteady weather. It's not consistent at all. And in the last few weeks, we've had weather that's been very severe. And we've had a lot of tornado warnings and thunderstorms. And then the next day, it'll be 75 degrees and people are wearing shorts again. So one of the things that I found was I would go out and I would try to find these trails where I could walk or run, and they would be just so soggy and you wouldn't be able to use them. Or I would want to go outside and walk just even around the neighborhood, and I wouldn't have that opportunity because the weather would be really bad. So I just started running in my house and running at work. So I got a lot of little sessions in, but I think it was a great experience. I actually still have the app, and I have been trying to increase it continuously, and I haven't increased as much as I did during intervention 1, but I'm still increasing from baseline data. And I do recommend it for everybody. I mean, it can't hurt, and I really didn't think I needed the motivation, but having that continuous feedback from your peers and seeing the visual aspect of it, even if you're not having feedback, is still really beneficial. I like just being able to see how far I've come since baseline, and to see on the graph my last data point is so much higher than my first data point. And I think everyone can use extra motivation, even if you don't necessarily need it right now. Of course, with any study, it is important to note the limitations to make sure they are addressed in future research. One limitation that impacted the study was time. Unfortunately, the replication of the study had to be done in a shorter time period than the original study. However, in the original study, some participants chose to move into intervention 2, while in the replication, all participants stayed in intervention 1. By having all participants stay in intervention 1, this allowed the span of the full duration to be dedicated to intervention 1. With that being said, it is important to note that having all the participants choose to stay in intervention 1 was a limitation due to it being different than the original study. Another limitation we felt it was important to discuss was the fact that, much like the original study, we did not collect maintenance data. Maintenance data would have showed us if the increasing trends were continued after the intervention. In the future, it would be helpful for studies to address this so we would know if the health effects possibly gained through intervention 1 are maintained or eliminated in the future. Since we all did the PAR-Q prior to the start of the study, there were really no personal limitations that did interfere. 2 of the participants did have medical limitations that were sent via email, but that did not show up in the study as that they would interfere.